We've got a range of speakers, from survivors to academics to practitioners, campaigners, and some of them all in the one bucket. And I hope it'll be really interesting for you. What I wanted to do is put a bit of context around today. So we've gone slightly off-piste, I suppose, like everyone else has. So our multi-agency working has taken a U-turn, really, and now is multi-agency working with COVID-19, and that's what the theme is today. I just wanted to kind of set the scene from SafeLives' point of view and what we've been doing for the last 4 weeks, which feels like 4 months, and I'm sure it does for you. What we did quite promptly, and we know we have the luxury of this being quite a small third sector charity, is we can turn our resources around quite quickly. So as soon as COVID lockdown was on the horizon, we rerouted our resources, and just in our DNA instinctively knew that we had to try and reach survivors. We had to try and bring their voices together, not only to amplify the words that they were saying, but give those people that make decisions some data and some evidence to say this is what's going on right now for the families who are experiencing domestic abuse. I think the thing that I will say that is just new for all of us is we all come to this with a huge amount of experience and expertise, but not one of us knows what domestic abuse means to a family in lockdown. We can assume, but what we really need to hear is from them, from their living rooms, what is really going on for them. And we've really tried at SafeLives to get that information how we can and where we can, and turn that information into practical tools, messages for influencing, and hopefully building networks with new partners across the sector, so that some of our services can get the funding that they desperately need right now to just maintain a service for people seeking help. So I feel that SafeLives has done that quite easily, but I'm also a police officer by trade, and I know it's more difficult to turn thousands and thousands of staff teams so quickly around, and they are, like health and everyone else, is experiencing huge demand, and it looks very different and probably feels a bit scary to everybody involved. So I just wanted to round that up by saying, as always, feedback. As always, tell us what we're missing. As always, tell us what you're doing on the ground, that we can use our platform and our audiences to influence, because that is our role as a second tier organisation, and we can't wait to hear from you after the webinar. So I'm going to hand over to Michelle, who's really done the heavy lifting around this workshop, and I just hope you all enjoy the webinar, and fingers crossed the tech works. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jo. And yes, I'm very glad that you mentioned the patients, because it is going to be really important today. And patient isn't one of SafeLives' values, but I thought it's worth mentioning what our values are. So we are human, and this workshop is very much going to reflect that. So please don't expect anything really slick, and if you do, you might be in the wrong workshop. So we are asking you to bear with us and be patient, but also hopefully that will make it a lot more enjoyable. It'll make it really refreshing as well, because we're going to take on a slightly different format. It's not just a kind of typical workshop show and tell type approach. What we've encouraged the speakers to do is to be really engaged with each other, and for this to be really interactive and quite dynamic, which leads us on to my one of our other values, which is brave. And the speakers are actually very brave, that they've all thrown themselves at this. They've come with me on a little bit of an imaginary journey as to how this will fit together, because I imagine that most of you are joining because you want to hear what the speakers have got to say, not just on their expertise, but actually how they want to talk to each other and the questions that they want to ask each other and probe each other on the work that they're going to present. We know some of them very well, some of them less well, but none of them are here by accident. We've asked them because of the work and the nature of the work that they do, and how we think actually there's a really great relevance of it in the time of COVID, but also because we know them and the personalities as well, and think that this is going to make the next 2 hours really interesting and engaging for all of you. We are trying to manage a lot of people, and we really want to hear what the speakers want to ask each other. So in terms of you contributing with questions, you can put questions into the chat box. What we would ask you to do is, you know, if you think you've got a really great question or a really burning question, please put that in there. But to make it easier to get through those questions, then we would ask you to, you know, kind of make a decision on how really useful for everyone you think that question is going to be, and we will do our best to ask it, and the speakers will do their best to answer it. All that being said, we are really rigorous, which is our third and final value. So like Joe said, we have put lots of work into this, especially the speakers, and we want to thank them for that. And hope that it all goes really swimmingly. So the speakers are going to introduce themselves at the start of each of their presentations, but just want to say thank you and welcome to Jane, Monckton Smith, Emily, Alison, James Rowlands and Frank Mullane, who I'm sure you'll all know are experts in their field, and Rachel, Williams and Natasha, who are SafeLives Pioneers, who bring the real authentic voice of survivors to all that we do, from their own experience, but also from the experience of the survivors and families who they have contacts with as well. Natasha, as you will have seen in the invitation, her video is not going to be on the screen, and that's because Natasha and her family are in witness protection. So I do just want to remind you of the information that went out in the invitation, just to say that although we are recording this, and we hope that all being well that we'll be able to upload it in a couple of weeks' time, that we're asking you not to record or share anything from what you're hearing, including Natasha's name or details of her story with anyone. Just very quickly to give you a swift overview of what the speakers are going to be covering, which, as with anything with domestic abuse, it always comes with a health warning, because we know it's a very, very difficult subject. We're reading about it in the press every day at the moment, which in many ways is a really good thing, because at least it's not being ignored, and the government and the media are doing what we've wanted them to do for a very long time, which is to do a bit of a public campaign of awareness raising around domestic abuse. It's just unfortunate that a lot of those stories are pretty horrible stories to have to hear. So the topics that we're going to be covering today, they are all related to the situation that we're in at the moment with COVID and the lockdown, but each of the speakers talking about it from their expertise as they know it. So they're not suddenly become experts on COVID and lockdown overnight, but Jane and Rachel are going to talk about Jane's homicide timeline and the implications of that in the COVID context. Frank is going to talk about domestic abuse and suicide, which is something that those of you who know Rachel may know she's had personal experience of, and it's also something that Natasha is going to contribute to. James is going to talk about the multi-agency response, and Emily is going to talk about engagement and rapport with perpetrators, and also talk about staff and client resilience in these COVID times as well. We've also got a couple of presentations from our SafeLives staff. However, we are also using their presentations just in case we start to run out of time. So I'm not going to go into too much detail about them now in case it doesn't happen. Okay, so I am going to hand straight over to Jane and Rachel, and Laura is going to stop sharing her screen so that we can hopefully see Jane and Rachel on the screen. Jane and Rachel, do you want to unmute and introduce yourselves?
Okay. I'm Jane Monckton Smith, and some of you will have seen me speak before, probably lots of you. I'm going to be talking about the homicide timeline.
And I'm Rachel Williams. As Michelle said, I'm a pioneer for Safe Lives, also an ambassador, and founder of Stand Up to Domestic Abuse, a campaigner and a qualified IDVA.
Okay, so I'll start, Rachel, just to introduce what we're going to talk about and how we are going to talk about it. We're going to have a conversation between us so that it's all very well hearing about the timeline, but it's really nice to hear it put into real life, real context, real experience. So I'll just, for anybody that might not know, the timeline is like tracks a journey or an escalation in risk for people who are in relationships dominated by coercive control or domestic abuse. The further you go along that timeline, the risk increases. So what makes that very relevant at the moment is with this lockdown. The lockdown has taken us like straight halfway along the timeline, straight into stage 4, which is a trigger or a challenge or something that is very difficult for a perpetrator. And this means that the whole COVID lockdown has made perpetrators and situations more volatile, and it does mean that stages could be travelled through more quickly than usual. So I'm going to talk, well, we're going to go through each stage very briefly, aren't we, Rachel?
Yeah.
What we'll do is we'll go through each stage and Rachel will explain her experience of that stage. So the first stage is history. So did you know of any history that your husband had of control and abuse?
No, I wasn't aware of anything. But I was obviously aware that he had a bit of a temper, but not of any previous.
But did you find out, you found out later, I think, didn't you, that he had past relationships where he hadn't been?
Yeah, it was only after the act what he done, which I will probably talk about on stage 8, that it then came out, transpired in a report that Darren had already had previous domestic abuse, where he done exactly the same, you know, beat her and everything else, and then tried to take his own life. So it was all there for everybody to see.
Oh, wow. So he really did do exactly the same thing, sort of more than once. Right.
Yeah.
Okay, so the second stage is, well, we've got somebody who probably does have a history or has characteristics that would be concerning, like jealousy and control, like you've just said. Stage 2 is like when you first meet and things can happen quite fast or can be very intense. How was it for you?
So it was pretty intense, Jane. You know, he was very charming. You know, told me a bit about his life. That, you know, 4 years prior to us meeting, his brother had committed suicide. He was brought up in a violent household. You know, and almost I felt quite sorry for him. Yeah, and obviously recognised that he had sort of issues. I was 21, he was 26. I was a single mum with a 2-year-old. So yeah, so I sort of like took him under my wing and sort of mothered him. That's what it felt like. I sort of mothered him, and things progressed pretty quick. And within a year, he had moved in with me, and I was pregnant.
Right. Okay. So, and did you feel like he was very interested in you? Was he giving you a lot of attention?
Oh yeah, you know, leaving me love notes, you know, really sort of, you know, really gushing over me. He would also buy stuff in the first couple of weeks, like Easter eggs and stuff like that for Josh, my little one, you know, so really sort of come into my family pretty quickly.
Right. Okay. And it's quite manipulative, really.
Yeah.
Potentially, isn't it? But also it can look a lot like love, can't it?
Yeah.
That kind of attention. So it might be easy to see it that way.
Yeah, and I can remember the jealousy aspect of it. That shows a little bit of his ugly head within a couple of months of being together, when there was a conversation down my friend's, it was her 21st birthday party, and we went to a barbecue, and an ex-boyfriend of mine was mentioned, and later then Darren sort of brought it up, which I resulted in retaliating and saying, hey, it's none of your business, sort of, to him. And I had been drinking, and then the next thing then, it was midnight, we were walking through a park on the way back from this barbecue, and I thought I'd lost my footing, and I ended headfirst in a stingy nettle bush down an embankment. And when I put my hand up for Darren to pull me up, he was nowhere to be seen, and he was traipsing off in front. And I still wasn't sure whether I was pushed or slipped. But looking back on it now, and Darren said to me later on that he was sorry, then I realised he'd pushed me, and he told me it was just because he got a bit jealous. It'd never happen again, and he don't know why he done it.
Right. So that kind of moves us on nicely, really, to stage 3 before we get to the more important stages, which is the relationship that you had with Darren. What was it like?
So it was sort of, it was quite good in the beginning. You know, I could see that he clearly had issues, but nothing, you know, I knew he had a short temper, but I used to say, you know, we don't all have a short temper, you know, we can all, you know, go off on one. But yeah, he was all right, you know, he seemed happy, but looking back on it now, he was happy because everything was going his way. And it was all about what he wanted in the relationship, you know, and to me now looking back, it was very much he was in control and he was happy when everything was his way.
Yeah, and of course stage 4 is that crucial moment when something happens to make them very unhappy. So something that challenges them, and that, as we know, is usually the threat of a separation. But, you know, it can be other things. It can be of financial problems and all of that kind of thing. And that's why COVID is important here, because that is one of those big challenges. So what was the big challenge that came for you?
So for me, I mean, the most significant
relationship,
for me was the moment when I decided that, you know, I couldn't be with him any longer, and that was after 18 years of going through this, walking on the eggshells, the outburst, you know, when he was violent towards me. Bearing in mind he was 6'7", 22 stone, with a 60-inch chest, you know, a real presence of a man, well known to the police, anti-police. That was all documented in the reports, and then I decided I had enough, and that was after he'd strangled me and slit his wrist in front of Jack, and that's when the fear then for me of staying with him became greater than the fear of leaving him. So I just sort of made a decision, it's got to be now.
That's quite a moment then, the fear of staying with him, actually, you know, you needed to get out. The levels changed for you there.
Yeah, and knowing that he always said that it was only one way out for me, and that was in a wooden box, you know, so it was either staying with him or facing the consequences, which I didn't know what the consequences were going to be, but just knew I had to get out because I was more fearful of staying then.
Yeah, and that he's making some quite serious threats there as well, isn't he? So when he found out that you were leaving him, things did start to escalate, didn't they? That stage 5, that things got kind of scary.
Yeah, so he was constantly texting. He was telling me that he was following me. I don't know how true that was. He turned up at my place of work, parked outside the shop in his Land Rover, just sat outside there for an hour. Yeah, so he didn't let up, and it was just like a 6-week period of intense stalking and harassment, which was never picked up by the police as that. I'd already given a long historical statement to the police. He was arrested, charged with common assault, even though he'd strangled me. And yeah, he knew then that he was losing his grip. You know, he tried to commit suicide with an overdose, and he then realised that there was no going back for me because I didn't even, you know, react to his failed suicide attempt when I was told he was in hospital.
And that's another really important moment in this journey, because all that escalation is about trying to get you back. But there was a point at which he realised you weren't coming back, and that's when stage 6 tends to happen. I will say at this stage as well, suicide, some people can become suicidal at this stage. So, but we will talk about homicide. So in stage 6, what I found was that there was like a change in thinking. That's what we call it, a change in thinking. So stalking researchers call it like last chance thinking. And we have talked before about some of those things he did that kind of merge between change in thinking and starting to plan.
Yeah, he was definitely planning, and looking back now, when he was arrested and he'd gone to court and he had these bail restrictions put on him, which he couldn't come within a 3-mile radius of the marital home. He was on a 6 till 6 curfew residing at his sister's, and he couldn't contact either of the boys as they were potential witnesses. The very next day, so that was on a Friday, the very next day he breached the bail restrictions by sending his sister to pick Jack up. So that was out the window, and I reported that to the police, but nothing, there was no quickness in reacting to that breach. And I think then he realised then that there was no coming back for me. And then the following week, he'd gone back to court to have his bail restrictions lifted by with his solicitor. So that would have been the 18th of August 2011. I had the police come up to the house and they wanted to make it more measure of safety at the house. So they turned my bedroom into a panic room. So my bedroom door was double skinned. I had a metal bar that I had to put on in the night. That was in case he broke any of the bail restrictions and come back to the house. But he'd gone back to court, ironically, the day before the incident happened, and the lay magistrates lifted all his bail restrictions, bearing in mind he had a history of an arsenal of weapons. He'd gone to prison for firearms. He threatened to kill me. He had mental health issues in respect of he'd had a nervous breakdown years ago, suffered with anxiety and depression, and the lay magistrates lifted it all. His only one bail condition was he could not drive into our drive, and there's only one way in and one way out anyway. So he could sit at the mouth of the drive and watch me, but he wasn't allowed to come into the drive. So that was all lifted the day before the incident, and he knew then, and I knew how serious things were because he started getting rid of his dogs. Now he was hunting. He was cruel to animals. He was a badger baiter, fox hunter. Think nothing of chucking a live cat in with his dogs to bring him on. So when his mate came up the house to remove all the dogs, I just thought then that he's really getting rid of these, not really understanding it all, but knew now looking back, he was tidying everything up.
Yeah, he was really in that stage 6, 7, wasn't he? He was clearing his life up because he knew what was going to happen, but nobody else did.
And apparently he phoned an ex-girlfriend who he was abusive 2 years ago and apologised to her for his behaviour then.
Oh, he absolutely knew what he was doing was wrong.
Yeah.
He absolutely knew that.
Yeah.
So he had plans in his head what he was going to do, clearly. So that's the final stage. So just tell her it's really shocking. But tell us, Rachel, what happened.
Yeah, so that was on the 18th of August. Everything was cleared up. On the 19th of August, I went to work. Lovely sunny day. Finally thought that I had my life sort of coming back together. First night I'd stayed in my home. Woke up, went to work in a hairdresser's, and approximately 2:20, Darren came in the salon armed with a sawn-off shotgun. I don't know why I did, but I ran towards him and started fighting with him because we know the F's, and we fight, flight, flop, freeze, and friend. And I just knew that he'd come there to kill me. And I just ran towards him, started fighting with him, wrestling with him for the gun, which at that point he hit me on the head with the butt of the gun. I'd fallen on the floor. There was an old lady on the floor as well. So it was a busy salon, hairdressers on a Friday afternoon. Managed to pull the reception desk over my legs, which he'd kicked away. And he just aimed the gun at my chest. And thankfully, I had presence of mind to pull my knees up under my chin. My left leg took the first shot, and the second shot skimmed past my ear. I looked to the left of me, and he put the gun down to reload. And it was a silver ornate sawn-off shotgun with all engraving on it. I grabbed the gun. There was a hefty battle because he couldn't retrieve the gun off me. And I know there was a hefty battle, and we were doing this motion because I had a watch on that day, and it was frosted in every direction. At that point then, I remembered him booting me under the chin. He stamped all over my head, really gave me a good hiding before he then fled the shop. And then he later found out that he'd killed himself.
So he was absolutely, I mean, God knows why you're alive, Rachel.
Yeah, I should. I'm a walking miracle, and thankfully I am able to share my story with others for learning, because I should be dead. That man could have killed me with his bare hands.
Absolutely, and I think that it's interesting for me, because I think I can see that your journey, you went through and he, more importantly, went through every single one of those 8 stages. And we can certainly learn a lot from putting your experience into that structure. But also, I think, and I don't know if you agree, but with this, the COVID lockdown, it's quite possible, and it looks like they're running through these stages more quickly.
Yeah, I think I totally agree. Yeah.
With because there is the pressure of the lockdown and all the things, but I think one of the last comment I would make about it is that even when the lockdown is eased, it's not going to stop, because there's going to be financial implications from people losing their jobs, and that creates more stage 4 and stage 5 problems. And there's going to be a lot of women, I think, who just think, I can't live with this person anymore.
Yeah, and I think for me, I think what Darren would have been like, after having 18 years with him, I think he would have ramped up the coercive and controlling behaviour, even though I didn't recognise I was coerced and controlled till 3 years after the shooting. When I was asked to speak at a conference, I said this to you before, and they said, about coercion. I said, I don't even know what coercion is. I said, but I'll speak at your conference. And they said, well, didn't you say that you couldn't grow your hair long, you couldn't wear a skirt, you weren't allowed to go out socialising with your friends, you couldn't cut a man's hair even though you're a hairdresser? And I was like, yeah. And they said, well, that's coercion. And then it was almost like a light bulb moment, because I did not know I was coerced. But I think now that if I was in lockdown now with Darren, I think he would have ramped it up, because there was no escape for any of us. And I think that would have been his new level of control going out of lockdown. He would have gained that much more authority and control. That would have become his new normal level of control.
Yeah, well, he'd have been able to set new rules, wouldn't he?
Yeah.
Very, very easily. And some of these people are going to come out of lockdown with extra problems as well. I think for our services, for SafeLives and the police and all of our care services, this is going to go on for a while.
Yeah.
Is what the timeline suggests. Thanks ever so much, Rachel. I think we actually kept to time.
I think we've done good, Jane. We've done good.
Yeah, I think we did do good. Is that okay, Michelle?
I think you did brilliant. Yes. Thank you both very much. That was perfect. And I've heard Rachel's experience lots of times, and every time I hear it has quite a profound effect on me, and always in different ways, actually. And often it's the context in which I hear it. And actually, that's the first time that I've heard Rachel's experience talked about alongside the timeline, Jane, and it also puts a different context on the timeline as well. So it was really helpful to hear it in both of those ways. Thank you, both of you. Does any of the other speakers have a question that they want to ask Jane or Rachel? Or a comment? No pressure.
Hi, we have had a question from Tanya, DCI. Rachel, thank you so much for sharing your story. Could the police have done more to help you?
Oh, the police could have done so much more to help. I had 36 police officers deal with my case in 6 weeks. So you can just imagine what got lost, missed, dropped, one picked up on. And tell you what was so frustrating, for every time I phoned to give the police new information about a breach or something like that, the officer who I was speaking to a day prior or 2 days prior had gone off on rest days for 4 or 5 days. I didn't know, so then I'd have to relay my story again, what was happening. That was so frustrating. There was so much more the police could have done, and like I said, Darren's history was there on his medical notes. You know, he wasn't invisible; he was very visible. It was just nobody was joining up the dots. And I say sometimes it's like that magic eye picture. The more you look at it, the more clearer it becomes. And it's just having that trained eye, picking up the jigsaw pieces, speaking to other agencies, you know. But he was visible. It was just that it was just wasn't picked up as it should have been picked up.
Thanks, Rachel. Anybody from the panel before we move on, James?
I had a question, Michelle, if that's all right. And thank you, Rachel. It's always great to hear you talk about your story and just see how you're using that to raise awareness. And I guess the thing which struck me was what you just said about he was doing a lot of that in plain sight. And I suppose I was really interested. I'm really interested in that idea of change in thinking. That moment that somebody's quite high up that path, as it were, and how, and it might be you, Jane, or you, Rachel, but what is it you think agencies need to be doing to, if they can, identify that change in thinking? Because I suppose sometimes that's still going to look the same from the outside to agencies, particularly taking your example, where you've got multiple police officers you're seeing, and you might be describing stuff which is not dissimilar to stuff you described before, and it's this one snippet of information which might indicate that change in thinking. What would you be saying to professionals to help really anchor their thinking around what that might look like, or how they could identify it more quickly or easily? Do
you mind if I just say something?
Yeah, go
Rachel?
on, Jane. Yeah.
You're absolutely right, James, that that change in thinking stage is really, really difficult for professionals especially, which is why they've got to listen to what victims are saying to them, because they are the ones who are noticing the changes. And I do think it's helpful to look at the 8 stages and think, well, we could be in stage 6. So I'm going to start asking those kinds of questions. I'm going to see if there have been any changes. Like there was one man in one case I was looking at where he had always been so routined about having his tea at 5 o'clock, and then one night, the night before he killed her, he just didn't care about having tea at 5 o'clock anymore. He had tea at 5:30, and the whole family were like, what the hell's going on here? But you wouldn't phone up the police and say, oh my God, we had tea at 5:30, would you? But it's something that you could perhaps put in a diary, or speak to your IDA about, or if there was a police call, you could tell the police that he's changed, there's something going on. I don't know.
I totally agree. Like if the police and services knew the timeline, so if somebody had said to me, right, has his behaviour, have you seen his behaviour change while you've been separated? And then when I could have said to him, well, actually, he's cleared out all his dogs. One of his friends have come up and cleared out all his dogs. And I know he's been, phoning his ex-girlfriend and apologising for his behaviour. When you're asking these questions, it becomes more visible. But I totally agree. I think, and it's the level of questions, and I think for services, that obviously with the police in my case, 36 officers dealt with my case in 6 weeks. He breached his restraining order. He breached his bail conditions. And I don't think enough questions was asked to me. I was almost like put to the side as almost like somebody being hysterical, because he'd come up the house to feed the dogs, even though I asked the police to stop him, and they said, oh well, we can't really, he can come round the side of the house. But I'd be hyperventilating because I knew what he was going to do, not shoot me, but I knew something bad was going to happen, and it was just furthering and ramping up his presence and control that I can still do this if I want to do this. But I certainly agree with you, it's definitely the questions that need to be asked.
I think.
Thanks, Rachel. Oh, sorry, go on, Emily.
I just wanted to step in. I mean, Rachel, thank you so much for going through that. I think it's so powerful to listen to, you know, the actual technicolor detail of that experience is horrific. And it just struck me when you were talking, one of the most poignant phrases was where you said the fear of staying had exceeded my fear of leaving, you know, and that was the moment where I thought things are wrong. And I think about the pressure that you were under, and, you know, as you say, you were the closest to being able to see those changes. And I wonder about some of his behavior, in him recognizing the way I'm behaving is not okay. Because you mentioned a few times that he would apologize, or he would acknowledge that what he was doing was wrong, which again doesn't in any way excuse it. But you know, I can't help but feel if somebody had access to him and was watching him, and not just you, of being able to say, you know, professionals engaged with them saying, this person's behavior has changed, this person is more dangerous, I can see their thinking changing, you know, not because the victim's telling me, which is important and critical to listen to, but because I'm directly seeing it change when I work with them.
Yeah, don't get me wrong, mind. I said that nobody could have changed Darren. He was so damaged. He wasn't meant to make old bones. And you know, his crying to me after an incident, that was all part of a game, just to, you know, and it's really hard for the victims, because we got to remember that, you know, not only is he the one that gives the love, he'll be the one to abuse, and then he's the one to console you. So, you know, when you see these women staying with these perpetrators for years and years, even though they recognize it's not right, the relationship, I would never have said, even though he was physically violent to me, that it was an abusive relationship, because there wasn't enough out there 9 years ago. Now I recognize how toxic the relationship was. I would have looked at it at an unhealthy relationship, but that was just our relationship. And I think, you know, more people need to be asking these questions and holding them to account, these perpetrators, because, you know, I don't think we do enough of that.
Can I just pick up on what you said as well, Emily? I think it's really interesting for professionals, if they do have access to him, you know, is to know what his thinking might be, to have those conversations with him, because it's another piece of the puzzle, isn't it? To be able to not necessarily directly challenge, but at least get intelligence and, you know, talk.
Yeah, I mean, I think absolutely, Jane. Certainly working with perpetrators, you know, I can think of, you know, lots and lots of cases where we've detected these early signals of risk escalating and been able to respond and be quite overt. I mean, I can think of a guy who basically was, again, you want to talk about triggers and sort of stage 4 and financial pressures everyone's under in terms of lockdown. But he'd been made redundant from a job that he'd had for, you know, 40 years. And was having lots of conflict over contact with the children, with his ex-partner. And he came into a session and was saying things like, I forget it, I give up, you know, I'm just going to write my goodbye letters and have that be the end of it. And that prompted an immediate direct response from us, where we did overtly say, we're concerned and we're going to take these steps, and we're going to flag your ex-partner's address, and we're going to ask you to suspend contact with the children for 2 weeks. And he, because he had a relationship with us, he agreed to that, and he did, you know, engage with us over those 2 weeks to try and bring his risk down. So I do think if you can get inside the perpetrator's head directly, you know, that's quite an important source not to ignore.
And you don't have to be a psychologist. Police officers can ask some of these questions around risk, can't they?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's true. I think, you know, professionals who are close and on the front line to working with domestic abuse definitely have a huge opportunity to ask some of these questions. But I don't know if that's necessarily our go-to way of working to engage with the perpetrator directly in terms of, because obviously what you'd be detecting there is someone who's unstable, whose mental health is deteriorating, who's becoming more dangerous. And the only way to address that isn't through punishment, it's through support. And I think for a lot of people that feels wrong.
I don't think, yeah, I understand what you're saying, but it's not always mental illness, is it?
No, definitely not. And I suppose I'm not saying necessarily mental illness, but someone's level of stability. You know, I think, Rachel, you mentioned that, you know, he'd had issues with anxiety, depression, and again, not necessarily a clinical diagnosis, but certainly some instabilities that we can pick up on.
Yeah, definitely. But then, you know, Darren was very measured with his abuse, and he was very controlled. And when he got arrested and they'd taken a statement off him, the police officer said that he come in like a raging lunatic, but said he's quite good. And even the police officer said he's almost like a chameleon. And Darren would fit into any role that he had to fit in at any time. He was very, very clever, but he was still visible for everybody to see. All they had to do was look on his notes and they could see what his history was, but they just didn't think to do that.
Can I say something, Michelle? Is that all right?
Yeah, no, we're good. Yeah, thanks, James.
On these calls, it's really interesting to hear that conversation, because I suppose it makes me think of two things, which is one, the identification. So how do you spot that something's changing, whether you're a police officer or a victim or a service, and then what's your intervention, right? Which I think is some of what Emily's talking about, particularly behaviour change interventions, where you might be able to manage risk, whether they're in probation services, for example, or community-based. And I guess one of the problems is we have so few perpetrator interventions. You know, obviously we've got Drive, which I'm sure some people are involved in. We have domestic violence perpetrator programs around the country, which are accredited by Respect, but our total capacity to actually intervene with a perpetrator and monitor them and engage with them is really limited. And if you think about something like a domestic violence perpetrator program, if someone would be on one of those programs, they're being potentially seen at least for say 3 hours a week in a structured program where there's a professional who's able to see some of those changes and comment and feed back into the system. But most men never get anywhere near that kind of intervention. So our ability to do some of this stuff is really limited. But then stepping back to the identification point, I think it's so important, and it makes me think of a number of domestic homicide reviews where the person who would go on to be the perpetrator of the homicide is going into A&E, for example, perhaps having self-harmed or having some other presenting issue, and talking about, you know, I've just broken up with my relationship, I'm feeling really depressed, I'm feeling really angry, and is making disclosures and is often not asked about risk to others, or is really asked about risk to others in a very limited way. And it's a really good example of missed opportunities to ask that question and then get that information somewhere. And whether that's an immediate, response in the context of an emergency, or it's kind of something a bit slower time. So yeah, I guess there's something about the intervention and the assessment that's really important.
So Jane,
last comment? Sorry,
yeah, go on.
Just want to make a last comment that, you know, that is for one type of homicide where, you know, the person is depressed or unstable. But, you know, if you watch, I think it was Ian Lawrence who planned the car crash, you know, that wasn't, you know, so there are so many different contexts in which these homicides happen. But, you know, it wouldn't hurt us to kind of just ask, not necessarily try and have a therapeutic conversation with a perpetrator, but try and perhaps work out where they are in the journey.
Thanks, Jane. And I realise now why actually I should have asked all the speakers to introduce themselves at the beginning. But what I'm going to do at this point is just bring Kyla Kirkpatrick in, who is the director for SafeLives Respect and Social Finance Drive programme, because I think she's got something that she wants to add to this. Kyla, are you there?
unmute. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Yeah.
Thanks, Kyla.
Oh, I think I accidentally put myself back on mute. Right. Thank you both very much. It's just so amazing to hear your story, Rachel. It's so insightful. And Jane, to also just to be listening to you talk through the stages and applying it in that way, it just enables me to really reflect on where the drive intervention sits in this. So drive is targeting work with high harm, high risk perpetrators. So I don't really have anything particular to add to what has already been said, but just to reflect that I can see how this plays out in drive's work and the point at which we're intervening. So it just seems really clear to me that the work that drive is doing is really focused around stage 4 and stage 5, triggers, escalation, and then stepping into the planning stage. And it just really struck me when Alison was speaking, you know, giving the example of where they did take the opportunity to respond really overtly to signs that risk was escalating and do something about that. And I think that is the bedrock of a lot of drive work, and it doesn't need to be therapeutic intervention. A lot of the interventions that we will make about being really overtly raising the flags around the risks with the perpetrator and with others isn't therapeutic. It's about putting other measures in place to make sure that there's a recognition of that risk and that steps are put in place to minimise it or disrupt it. So that's really interesting. I think the other things that, you know, we just can't say enough is that this is not invisible, and a number of people speaking have mentioned how visible this is, and it's a question of joining up the dots, asking the questions, probing, and I think that also is at the core of a lot of the work that Drive does, and recognising really early on that a lot of people do know what's going on, but the dots aren't joined up and the right questions aren't asked. And I think that one of the things I'm really interested in is empowering more people to be probing and to be curious and to ask questions. And of course, we need to make sure that it happens safely, but it's finding that point, the right optimal point for more professionals to feel empowered to probe and ask questions and hold perpetrators to account, rather than be afraid to ask the questions because they have a sense that it might not be safe. And I don't think we're quite there yet. There's a lot of work to do, but I can see a path through to that. And this kind of conversation, I think, is inspiring to hear people thinking in that way, and really looking at what more can different professionals do to bring this into the light, doing it safely, but not being too afraid to act at all.
Kyla, can I just ask a question that someone has posted? They've said that there's a real opportunity to look at routine inquiry approaches, such as in health settings, and if anyone is adopting this approach nationally. Yeah, so I think health, I also think across our mental health and substance misuse services, there's huge opportunity. You know, if you look across general health services, and particularly substance misuse and mental health, and I appreciate that they're not always issues in these cases. To your more recent point, Jane, I agree with that. But there is an army of workers out there who have very transferable skills, communication skills, that could be taking on this work. I absolutely agree.
Can I add something to that, Michelle? Yeah. Just that I think routine inquiry is really important. It's something we need people to think about generally, about asking about domestic abuse, and some of the stuff that Rachel was talking about, changes in what people are doing. But what comes up time and time again in domestic homicide reviews is, if you perhaps look back when reviews first started, we were making recommendations about, you need to introduce routine inquiry, you need to have training, you need to have a pathway. That's not where we are now in many ways, in most sectors. Now we're in a place of saying, well, you've got a pathway, or you've got an intervention, or you've got a policy, but it didn't get used on this occasion, or it's not working for some reason. So, and I think routine inquiry is a good example of that. But we can say we want routine inquiry, say in midwifery, where it makes complete sense. But the key question then is, how do you make sure professionals ask that question in a way which actually is useful rather than procedural, and what kind of what skills and competence and confidence do they have in asking that question. So I think that's the not the note of caution, I suppose, is this kind of intervention. We need everyone to be doing this, but we need everyone to be doing it well, and that's a question of implementation. So how do you get people to do that well and consistently? And the mental health risk to others is a really good example. People will be seeing someone presenting at A&E who's talking about suicide, which is of course a risk indicator, and they ask about risk to others, but do it in a terribly kind of narrow sense. So they mean right now rather than generally in terms of domestic violence, and then you've lost that option to do some of what people here have been talking about sharing it in the context rather than that specific incident. Yeah,
and I think I completely agree. I think the potential is there, but there's a lot of work to be done to do, as you say, is have that workforce development, the training, the right questions asked, and I think the pathways aren't quite there. They need to be much clearer, robust pathways so that those lines of inquiry can be followed up.
Thanks, everyone. It might interest you to know that we had a call yesterday with 20-odd chief executives from frontline domestic abuse organisations, and Saskia Ritchie from Cheshire Without Abuse, who runs a programme that works with perpetrators. Emily is very familiar with it because they use the Engage programme, which Emily wrote. But they did a short social media campaign aimed at perpetrators of abuse in the current situation, and within 2 weeks they got 46 self-referrals to their programme, which she said is over half what they would expect annually. So it completely took them by surprise, and they've now got to be able to respond to it, because obviously what they're not going to do is put anybody on a waiting list for the next 6 months. But it shows as well that actually there's 46 people there. I think they were all men. They were mostly living with their families, and when somebody reached in and offered them support, they reached out for it and said, yeah, we want it. And I think too often as well we can make assumptions that, one, reaching into perpetrators is dangerous, and two, that we can't talk to them like the men and human beings that they actually are. And obviously there will be some people, Darren's at different parts of the spectrum, but yeah, that's something. And actually as well, that's something that occurred for Cheshire Without Abuse because they used the virtual internet, the medium that we're all using today. They wouldn't have actually done that if they'd have continued on the normal face-to-face basis and face-to-face way of interacting.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much, everybody. That was really interesting. We've got Frank next on the agenda, if we have Frank with us, because he's had lots and lots of internet problems, so he's been dropping in and out. Are you there, Frank?
I am. Can you hear me?
Fabulous. Yes, we can. And I know you missed lots of what Jane and Rachel were talking about in terms of the timeline, but please, over to you now to talk about domestic abuse and suicide. And when you've finished, I'm going to introduce Natasha.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, SafeLives, Michelle, Laura, Jo, Colette and Claire, all of whom I've spoken to today. And welcome to Natasha and Rachel. Please comment anytime during the next few moments when I'm speaking, anytime you wish, and welcome everybody else. So I'm the CEO of AAFDA, which is Advocacy After Fatal Domestic Abuse. And we are a developing centre of excellence for all of the reviews that take place after fatal domestic abuse. And we provide specialist and expert advocacy for the families after domestic homicide and suicides and what are often termed at some stage unexplained deaths. And we also provide a specialist form of peer support, as in all of our advocates have either experienced murder or themselves suffered serious domestic abuse. They go through quite a rigorous selection and training process to ensure that they're the right people after that. To do this work, I should say. So how do I go to the next slide? Do I just press down arrow? Oh no, you do it. Thank you. But I wanted to concentrate today on suicide and domestic abuse. It's something that we provided evidence to the Home Affairs Committee on, and that's recently published that evidence and mentioned in their report. Now, nobody knows how many people take their own life because of domestic abuse. So I saw in the report that South of Black Sisters said before COVID that 3 women a week were doing that. I'm assuming they meant England and Wales, but I don't know. But Sylvia Walby, quite old research now, but she estimated between 4 and 10 women a week. And we don't know men and children. I'm not aware of research that states how many men and children took their own lives. But the point about this is that we saw a spike in homicides recently. I don't think it's over long enough for us to credibly extrapolate those numbers and say, look, this is going to recur. I don't see how we can do that, and I hope it doesn't occur, obviously. But if that spike was true, and it was something like 5 women a week, then that's a ratio of 2.5 times the homicide rate. And if you applied that rate to suicides, you know, it's more like 8 to 10 to 20 women a week, which sounds extraordinary, and maybe the case, we simply don't know. So we wanted to present evidence to the Home Affairs Committee because we had not seen government responses mention the risk of suicide during Corona. Sorry, I'm trying to move the slide down. Sorry, Michelle. Thank you. So I thought this quote from the Refuge research was very poignant at the moment, because that's my underlining. Just let you read that. I've read the suicide notes of people who have taken their own lives from domestic abuse, and some of them reflect this. But I just thought that word trap, of course, has got a double meaning now, and the trapping becomes more intense. Now, I think, please somebody tell me if I'm wrong, I thought I read in the Refuge research that something like 30 women may attempt to take their own lives every week. So, on the next slide, please, Michelle. Remember, Rachel or Natasha, please come in, contradict me, say anything, challenge, your own views, whichever you like. So, first of all, we have seen some incredibly good police investigation. You take the case of Stephen Gain in Hertfordshire, for example, was convicted of coercive control.
Frank,
Yes.
sorry to interrupt you. We're struggling to hear you a little bit. I don't know whether you're able to adjust your microphone at all or move your computer, whatever you're using, closer to you.
Yeah, let me try. Is that better?
Oh, that is better. Yes, thank you.
Shall I go back to 1976 when I started talking about this stuff, or just? I just wanted to say there has been some fantastic police work on some domestic abuse suicides which have resulted in convictions, and I'm aware of 3. Stephen Gain for coercive control, Nicholas Allen for manslaughter, and Belina Wallace. I don't know what she was convicted of, but she got 11 years. She was charged with murder initially, but it was reduced to something, and the police in the audience would know what kind of conviction would attract 11 years. But I do think, I'm afraid to say, we've come across cases. We're now helping 30 families with domestic homicide reviews or other work after suicides and unexplained deaths. And there are cases where there is a long antecedent history of domestic abuse, but there's been no investigation, no golden hour exploitation of a suicide to give any form of criminality a chance to be pursued, or for the family to have the right story of where that person took their life. And I think that suicides from domestic abuse are some of the saddest and loneliest and most silent of the deaths. And very often the people that go to the grave have attached to them a stigma. It's not, you know, oh, they weren't resilient enough, or they just couldn't hack it, or they took easy way out, all of these kind of inaccurate comments. The second point there is we asked the government to consider that police somehow need to record suicides from domestic abuse. Now, they won't know for certain that it was suicide from domestic abuse at the initial stage of course, but they will be aware when there is a significant domestic abuse antecedent history, such that they begin to record this as indicative of suicides from domestic abuse. That would be very helpful. I think that the inquest, the coronial understanding of domestic suicide is to improve significantly.
Frank, I'm so sorry. We're losing you again, and I don't want you to be sharing really valuable information that people aren't hearing. The only other thing I could suggest is if you perhaps turn your camera off, just in case it's also an internet issue, because I know you've been struggling.
I wish I knew how to do that, Michelle.
You're clear again now. I think maybe your microphone's very sensitive and just picks you up when you sat in a particular position like that.
All right, okay.
That's really clear now.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, everybody. You may be aware of a case called Mullane, M-A-U-G-H-A-N, which means about 2 years ago in July 2018. From then, coroners can now make conclusions, as they're called now, of suicide on the balance of probability, whereas previously it had to be beyond reasonable doubt, i.e. the criminal standard. What that means is we are likely to see more suicides recorded in inquest courts, but because unlawful killing is still at the standard of beyond reasonable doubt, criminal standard, it may be that some suicides that might in fact be homicides or suicides that were caused by somebody, i.e. the Nicholas Allen case, was done for manslaughter, are not treated appropriately in the inquest court. So I think there's a significant improvement required in coroners' understanding of domestic abuse and suicide. Final point there was that the National Police Chief Council said that police time, some of it had been freed up now. And I think they were referring to acquisitive crime. Can you hear me now, Michelle? And my understanding is people like burglars and stuff, you know, they can't be so busy at the moment, and they're presumably not allowed to join the furlough scheme, or one hopes not. So I think Louisa Rolfe might have said this, or somebody in the NPCC, that there is a degree of police time freed up now, might be able to be put into domestic abuse.
Frank, you're going again.
Okay, well, I'm pretty nearly finished. Can you hear me?
Yes.
If you go to the next slide, I think it's the last one. So if you want to talk about any of this with me, please use any of those contact details there. And we are available to help families after domestic homicide, suicide, or any of those unexplained deaths. And all we're trying to do, like all of you here today, is make a safer future. So thanks everybody for listening, if you got some of that. And, you know, we have a chat now, I think, Marie.
Thanks, Frank. And just to say that, you know, you and AAFDA and Sarah and all your colleagues, your advocates, are just amazing. And it's a reason why you're here today. You do incredible things in terms of supporting families who've lost someone to domestic abuse, and also the work that you do in relation to the government and changing practice is incredible. So thank you. And what I want to do now is to just bring in Natasha. Just to reiterate, Natasha is, you know, there's absolutely no recordings or sharing of information from Natasha. But Natasha, just obviously introduce yourself and just tell us your experience and expertise.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'd firstly like to start by thanking Frank for tackling this very sensitive subject. Speaking solely from a victim's perspective, it is refreshing to see someone of Frank's stature within the DV sector talking about this very sensitive subject. So thank you, Frank. For those of you not familiar with my story, and to put my experience into context, I have a background of child abuse and experienced both physical and sexual abuse, with the sexual abuse starting at age 4 and involving multiple men. This abuse continued throughout my entire childhood. At age 18, I went on to experience 24 years of domestic violence at the hands of my husband, which included sexual abuse, physical abuse, financial abuse, and coercive control. Towards the latter part of our marriage, other men were brought into the abuse, and countless sexual assaults by numerous men were once again a feature in my life. I first attempted suicide at the age of 17. I saw suicide as the only option available to me to escape the abuse, and of course it guaranteed that the abuse would end. Put simply, if I wasn't alive, my abuse couldn't continue. Sadly, my attempt at ending my life was not successful, and it merely resulted in my abuse intensifying as a form of punishment for daring to end my own life. I next attempted suicide at age 19. The abuse had only continued, although now at the hands of my husband, and I could see no other alternative to make the abuse stop. My husband discovered me shortly after the attempt and took me to A&E, which prevented my death. As the years passed, these attempts went on to be used by my husband as threats. If I ever tried to leave or disclose my abuse to authorities, he said I would never be believed because I was mental, and these attempts would prove that. Also, one of the men my husband introduced into the abuse in the latter years worked in the medical profession. He abused multiple patients of his, but he only targeted patients with a history of mental abuse, be that drug abuse, a history of self-harm or suicide, or an eating disorder. He informed me he deliberately chose us because if we did ever disclose the abuse to authorities, he felt confident that no agency would believe a story from a nutcase over his version as a well-respected member of the medical community. Towards the end of my abuse by him, he actively encouraged me to end my life, saying my life was so useless and the only thing I was good for was to be abused. And sadly, these threats of not being believed proved true. When I eventually disclosed the abuse, one of the first questions I was asked was, "Have you ever had any mental health problems? Have you ever self-harmed or attempted suicide?" Naturally, social services asked my husband and extended family members if I had a history of mental health problems, and of course, they were only too happy to discuss my suicide attempts. Immediately, you were categorized and labeled. Words such as unstable, disturbed, difficult, insane, crazy, sick in the head, she's not quite right upstairs, were either said in meetings or written in case notes. I was less than a human being. My suicide attempts were used to discredit me and proof that I was lying. Not once did any professional involved in my case ask me why I had attempted to end my life, or view my attempts as an escape from all the abuse. Unfortunately, disclosing the abuse did not mean an end to my suicide attempts. After we fled the family home, the complex nature of my case became apparent. My case was sent to various specialized units within the police. However, each unit it was sent to found a reason why it didn't fit their individual remit, and so refused to accept responsibility for the case. This ultimately led to 18 different police officers managing and investigating their own individual incidents. The entire process became too overwhelming, and I simply couldn't cope with having to constantly recount over and over again the abuse I had endured with all of these different police officers. I told every professional involved in my case that I was not coping with the way the case was being managed. I told the police, the social worker, my IDVA, my GP, but no one listened, and the police went so far as to say that it was not their job to accommodate my needs. Finally, once again, I saw only one option to end the distress. My suicide was prevented when a motorist noticed me standing on the bridge over a busy motorway and phoned the police. Officers attended the scene, and I was removed and escorted to A&E for a mental health assessment. The social worker assigned to our case took this suicide attempt as further evidence that I was mentally unstable. She noted in her case notes that I was psychotic and the children should be removed from my care. The psychiatrist and psychologist conducting the mental health assessment diagnosed me with complex post-traumatic stress disorder, severe depression, and severe anxiety. They stated I posed no risk to my children or to other members of the public, and concluded that my suicide attempt was a normal response to the trauma I had endured and was continuing to experience. The psychiatrist even commented that she would be far more concerned about me had I not had this response. To conclude, I find it absolutely bewildering that on the one hand, we have professionals who accept suicide as a result of abuse as a normal response to that trauma. Yet, on the other hand, we have professionals working within the sector who view you with such disdain and regard you as difficult and disturbed for taking that option. Thank you for your time today, and thank you once again to Frank for raising this issue.
Thank you, Natasha. And it's such a critical issue that is overlooked and that we have to understand. And when people like Frank and yourself talk from your different experience and expertise, and hopefully it will go some way in really making a difference and making sure that people who need the help get the right help and at the right time, and also that the professionals and the organisations and the multi-agency forums who need to work together to keep families safe understand and work together in the right way. And I know we've talked about that at length, and it's something that James is going to touch on as well, multi-agency working at its worst and at its best in his presentation. Does any of the panel want to come in and say anything? Okay, thank you everyone. Just like to get to that uncomfortable silence to make sure that I'm not coming back too quickly and know that everybody's got to unmute themselves. I just want to thank Natasha for the work that she's done with us. Rachel's worked with us for many years. Natasha has been working with us for around 6 months now, and I first heard Natasha at Rachel's Stand Up to Domestic Abuse first survivor-led conference, which was held in Wales last September, which was a remarkable event, and it was incredible to hear Natasha speak at that event. And she talked about her experience, what she's described now, and also some other aspects of it, particularly the multi-agency working and how the MARAC operated to support Natasha, or otherwise didn't when it wasn't working at its best. So James, can I hand over to you now to talk about your multi-agency response? Well, not your multi-agency response, but multi-agency responses.
Yeah, of course, that's fine. I was going to say, I'm not sure I've got a multi-agency response operating from my room in a wet Brighton, but there you go. Thank you, and thanks Natasha and Frank for your inputs. They were really great to hear. So I'm going to just talk, really reflect a bit on multi-agency responses, and I suppose the context, just so people know a bit about me, that I'm coming from, is I used to be a domestic and sexual violence commissioner, so I commissioned services across 2 boroughs in the southeast of England for 5 years, including things like our domestic violence services, sexual violence services, and having oversight of 3 MARAC processes. But my main focus these days is working on domestic homicide reviews. I chair domestic homicide reviews with Standing Together Against Domestic Violence, but I'm also doing a PhD looking at them as a mechanism about how, and looking at how they work. So that's the kind of perspective, hopefully, I'm going to bring as I just talk for these few brief moments. So if we could go to the next slide, if that's all right, whoever's in control of the slides. The next slide, if that's all right. Brill. So hopefully people can see that. And I guess I wanted to start by making a point, which is, you know, this whole situation is utterly exceptional, and it's clearly an extraordinary set of circumstances. But there's 2 things we might say about that. One, it's exceptional for us in the UK, but actually there's really good evidence internationally that economic uncertainty, civil unrest, disasters, including health disasters, are linked to a myriad of forms of violence against women and girls. And I guess I make that point for 2 two reasons. One, we can be really clear, although we don't necessarily know what the change to homicide rates will look like in the long term. We don't know what that trend is yet. We can be confident that there will be an increase. But also, secondly, it's a really good example where in wealthy developed countries, we can sometimes forget that other countries which are less wealthy might have experience that we can draw on. So lots of countries outside Europe and North America, for example, will have experience of working on things like domestic violence and violence against women and girls during a time of crisis, whatever that might be. And actually some of the really valuable research and evidence is actually to be found there. And that's actually some of the stuff that I'm quoting here. I guess what we know, though, is globally those reports are coming through, certainly specifically around domestic violence, and certainly we're seeing that in the UK. The Home Office, House of Commons Home Affairs Select Committee released a report earlier this week which detailed some of that. So people like Refuge reporting a 50% increase in calls to their helpline, the Men's Advice Line doing the same for male victims, also reporting an increase in terms of their perpetrator helpline, and then Counting Dead Women has talked about 14 domestic abuse killings of women, about double the normal rate. And I guess a lot of that is absolutely going to be associated with some of the impact of corona, whether that's and not largely the mitigations around that. So things like containment, delay and mitigation. And I guess the point which we've touched on, but perhaps we haven't made explicit yet, is that so many of the strategies that we're now enforcing as part of government routine are actually the same strategies that perpetrators would be using. And I think that's something we really need to think about. And that point I think Rachel made about people perhaps coming out of this as perpetrators with a new normal, with a heightened level of abuse, perhaps is a really relevant reminder of that. And a lot of our focus, understandably, has focused on improved professional responses, so identification, also community awareness, and thinking about promotion of routes to safety and how we reconfigure our services. So you'll all be aware, I'm sure, of what's happened within your organisations to adjust to this new normal in terms of service redesign, and that's happening with specialist services as well. So a lot of our services are changing shape in real time, and I think that's going to have some consequences we may need to think about. So if I could perhaps go to the next slide briefly. So continuing my point, I suppose COVID-19 is an exceptional event, but it could distract us, I suppose, from some of our pre-existing responses, because most of the avenues we're going to be using to respond are essentially the same avenues we would have used before. We might be re-engineering them, we might be delivering them differently, but we're in many ways doing the same kind of things, walking down similar paths that we would have done previously. We're just adjusting them. You know, there's something about making sure we don't get distracted by the exceptionalness of COVID to not look at actually what does this mean about the underlying system. So for me, what I was thinking about was our coordinated community response. And at its best, what we're talking about is shared aims, information sharing, collaboration. But at its worst, when it's not working, those things don't always happen. And actually, there's some really profound barriers to victims and perpetrators necessarily getting help or having intervention. So I've listed some of them there in language I use. I don't know what other people think about those, but a lot of our safety net is not always terribly accessible. A lot of our interventions are short-term or incident focused. Perpetrators are often not in view, or they're only in view for a very short period of time. And actually a really key issue is lots of our specialist services have really short-term funding, particularly domestic violence services, but also a lot of the services which will support recovery. So things like access to counselling. There's real issues with demand and funding. So some of what our normal system looks like is already facing real challenges, which are just then exacerbated by COVID. So I want to give two examples from domestic homicide reviews, and then I'll kind of wrap up if I may. So perhaps jumping to the next slide. The first case I want to talk about it actually relates to LGBT victims, so lesbian, gay, bi and trans victims. And in a domestic homicide review that I chaired, what became really apparent is the local area was doing some very good stuff around domestic abuse, but one of the things which was difficult was a lot of that material wasn't specifically targeted to LGBT victims. So there was generic publicity, for example, which didn't always speak specifically to LGBT victims. And that's a problem because we know from the research that most LGBT victims, like any victim, will face barriers to both identifying their abuse but also disclosing it. But in the case of LGBT victims, a particular example of a barrier is that they often don't recognise themselves in the public story of domestic abuse. And public story is a phrase that someone called Catherine Donovan uses to describe how we talk about domestic abuse in agencies, in the media, and so on. And often that story does not include LGBT people. And the problem with that is if people don't see themselves represented, they may not identify those behaviours, or they may not feel safe to go to a service. So I make that point generally because then I'm asking the question, what right now about our responses mean we might be replicating that problem? So certainly a lot of the communications I've seen developed in response to COVID are really good, and they're really trying to reach victims, but very few of them include targeted work to reach LGBT victims. So I suppose the point I'm making is that our underlying system sometimes misses things, and LGBT victims can be an example of that. And that's just potentially getting repeated when we very quickly try and turn around what we know. I think that probably applies to other communities as well. I was speaking to a colleague in another area who has talked about their service very rapidly getting publicity out into pharmacies and so on, which is brilliant. It's absolutely brilliant work. But what she's been able to recognise is what they haven't done is translated any of that material at this stage. And they would normally do that, actually. So it's a good example of that. Perhaps some of our pathways aren't always as robust as we might want. And we need now, in a time of crisis, to make sure we do that double checking to make sure we reach all the other victims who might be out there and not seeing that information. The other example I just want to draw on briefly relates to safeguarding, and this is from a DHR where stalking was a particular feature, and what became really apparent from that DHR is that most of our interventions are directed to individuals, as you'd expect in some ways, and most often the victim. And that they're usually targeted in a really specific way. So we're talking about home visits or appointments or telephone calls or drop-ins or some kind of time-limited piece of contact. And when we're not talking about that direct intervention, often what we're talking about is passive monitoring. So in this case, it involved where there were some young children, a lot of the services which were involved at various points were relying on the school to notice things were up with the children in order to trigger further concerns. So that's what I mean by passive monitoring. And then thirdly, perpetrators often aren't in view at all. And this was certainly the case in that DHR, except for these specific incidents, perhaps where the police were involved. And I suppose I want to just make that point because I think that's really showing up now in our response to COVID, which is that how difficult it is to then re-engineer interventions which are more than those individual targeted interventions. So we are talking about developing community resources, for example, which is brilliant, but it's really hard to build those in a short period of time, and certainly to build those in a way that's safe. So it might mean we as professionals have to think about what is it we can do with those different methods of communication, for example, or how might we provide practical help in different ways. And then as a kind of final kind of observation on my last slide, clearly, if that's all right, who's ever controlling the slide controller, is clearly the focus is on the here and now. But we also need to start thinking about what happens in the medium to long term. So we're probably talking about a gradual easing over time, and it's really difficult to know what the future will look like. But there's real issues for provision and the shape and design of services. So many of our services are being stretched and changed in their shape we need to think about how we then make them sustainable. So at what point do we stop and take breath and start thinking, well, how do we continue to deliver these services in what way, particularly as we go to that new normal where we may be seeing increased demand, or we may be seeing people accessing in different ways. The other thing I think we need to think about is cliff edges. So actually, there's been a lot of emphasis on short-term or emergency funding. I know my local area has been pumping some resources into some of our charitable sector, for example. I know government keeps saying that some money's coming. I don't know whether that's got to the front line yet. But at some point, you know, what is the long-term planning behind that funding, and also how might our demand profile change? So, you know, we're talking about increased reporting, but are we talking about increased prevalence overall, or just more people coming forward? And we're not necessarily sure what that looks like. But how do we make sure services can respond to that in the long term? And then I guess the last 2 points about impact, which will link to what Emily's talking about. We really need to start thinking about impact on service users, but also staff. So what's the long-term impact of all this work? So I certainly know, and I'm sure many of you have been dealing with a whole host of stuff changing in the last 3 weeks. But it's also interesting to note that we're suddenly then getting into new normal. So I've chaired 3 domestic homicide reviews since this started, 3 different meetings. And in the first 2, it felt really strange and unusual. And in the third, it was really noticeable how much more comfortable and confident people were on using an online medium. But it meant we didn't then attend to that. We didn't speak properly about what might be different and what we might not be able to do online that we would do normally. So I think we forget about change quite quickly sometimes. And then the final thing I just want to say, and of course I'd say this as a former commissioner, but how do we, and people will probably roll their eyes, but how do we evaluate what's happening? And I know nobody wants to be doing evaluation forms right now, and I'm not suggesting that's what we need to do, but there is something really important about learning about what does and doesn't work. And also critically whether what we're doing quickly is actually effective. And the risk is we kind of front load a load of changes and we don't know if they're having an impact. So there's something about how do we start building in some evaluations as light as possible, but to make sure we know these things are working and are effective and are sustainable. So that's it from me.
Thanks, James. And yeah, to end on that note, I think it is commissioner or not, ex-commissioner or not, it's very thought-provoking, and it is really important to consider it. And I think as well, you know, the way that the data is interpreted, I'm sure we all kind of cringe when data gets put out in the media, and you know, we know how we might interpret it, we know how people who don't understand domestic abuse will interpret it. And someone has just made a comment that we need to be clear that the increase is in reports of domestic abuse. The actual incidents of domestic abuse, certainly in regards to the police, have fallen in some places. And someone else has commented that referrals to children's social care have significantly reduced. So obviously all of this is at the early stages, like you said, but it is important that we don't perhaps as well just take the data and the numbers on face value, but actually start to interrogate it, that the right people do that and that the right messages are given out from that. There is also a question that somebody asked earlier, which I'm not going to ask anybody to answer because I think Emily's presentation might answer it. So they said, in our area, some professionals have raised concerns that asking routine questions during COVID-19 is not safe. Please, can I ask the panel's views on this? And what I'm going to do is go straight over to Emily. If that's okay, Emily. I think your presentation might cover a number of things, and then if there's we can move on from Drive. Thank you. And if there is time at the end, then we'll have a bit more of a discussion with all of you. Thank you. We'll just get onto your slides, Emily.
Okay. Yes, I did. Thanks very much, Michelle. I did see that comment come up and thought, oh yes, you know, that's going to be covered when we get to this presentation. And I just wanted to give a little bit of, well, guidance really on having these difficult conversations. And I have to say, I'm still kind of feeling the impact of Natasha's narrative and how she felt she was treated and spoken to by professionals. And I have to say, working with both sides of this from an intervention point of view, coming at perpetrator work on the one hand, but also I've done a lot of work with victims who their concerns have been raised around their capacity to protect. And I think this kind of combative attitude that can develop between professionals and their clients, especially when their clients are in complex situations with multiple needs and aren't very compliant for a number of reasons. They're not very compliant with conditions. They won't do what we're asking them to do, and they don't seem to be able to change. And that can be really frustrating, and I think lead to a lot of breakdown in professionals' relationships with clients. Could I have the next slide, please? Sorry, so yes, just a tiny bit. This information I'm going to go through in this talk is just a segment of a interpersonal model that I've been working on and researching for the last 8 years, really, at the University of Liverpool. So there are papers out there that you can look at if you're interested in it or you want to learn more. I'll just mention that so you know where it's coming from. Next slide, please. Thank you. The theoretical backdrop might be familiar to quite a few people because it draws on core principles of motivational interviewing. And motivational interviewing is all about challenging people without being confrontational. So we need to be able to challenge people's behavior, whether that is a substance misuse professional challenging somebody's use of substances, or whether that is a GP challenging somebody managing their own diabetes, or whether that is us as professionals challenging the way people are managing conflict in their relationships. But that challenge, and I often hear the rhetoric, especially around perpetrators, of holding them to account, support victims, but hold perpetrators to account. And that feels combative immediately. And I think it sets up for professionals a dynamic where my goal with victims is to support, unless they won't do what I'm telling them to do, and then I get annoyed and that gets combative. And my goal with perpetrators is to judge, monitor, punish. And I think it's quite revealing of thinking, why would people come to us for support or help if they feel that that's the response that they're going to get? And I'm not saying all. I have no illusions that, having worked with perpetrators for the last 20 years and worked with over 1,000 families experiencing domestic abuse, I know that not all of them are going to seek help. But a lot of them, once you offer it, they do engage. And I think that's what I'd want to focus on, is for frontline professionals, especially in the current situation, if you're the one opportunity that we have to have that conversation, either with a victim who's extremely reluctant to report or might even be combative with you because they're scared of the consequences of what will happen if they talk about the abuse, or engaging with that perpetrator, then I would want professionals to have the confidence to be able to do that, and to do that well. So the slides I'm going to go through just give a few tips about having those difficult conversations with people. Again, I feel like a lot of professionals, you're used to having difficult conversations with people, whether that's about their parenting and their approaches to discipline or things like that. And really, those same skills that you draw on fit this context. So we'll go through a few of those. If I'll just say a little bit about this slide, the ethos of motivational interviewing is really about being more persuasive than coercive. So I will encourage you rather than pressure you to cooperate. And I think if we think about some of our multi-agency partners or how agencies approach domestic abuse, when we implement change within a household, does that feel like we're encouraging cooperation, or does it feel like we're pressuring and restricting? So again, it's part of this is about the culture agencies carry with them as they come through the door. The second point, be more supportive than argumentative. I will actively listen and try to understand your perspective rather than try and force my own view or agenda onto you. Again, that's not us letting our requirements fall by the wayside, but part of this is that, certainly in my experience, just to have that conversation with a perpetrator where they aren't feeling listened to, they're just feeling judged or spoken at, or like you're just looking for opportunities to attack them, doesn't create that atmosphere of rapport or engagement that we need, not only to change their behavior, but also to monitor them, to have that window into the household. And I think that's really important. And then the last one, that change, if we are trying to change people's behavior, always arises from within rather than being imposed from outside. So we may have to implement hard bottom line conditions to safeguard people in that household. And I absolutely am not saying, oh, well, we need to go in, you know, with open arms and not put those conditions in place. But part of that is, well, how do I deliver somebody a bottom line message of this is what has to happen and still maintain rapport with them? So that's what the next 4 slides we're going to do give you 4 key approaches to use when you're trying to devise those sorts of conversations with people. Okay, next slide, please. Right, so each one of these 4 skills I describe as a tightrope. So it's always a balancing act for us as professionals, trying to hit that sweet spot of maintaining rapport, but still also maintaining some kind of influence or authority in that relationship. You know, at the end of the day, we have safeguarding responsibilities as professionals, and those can never be ignored or be, you know, lax about. Next slide, please. So the first principle is honesty. And this really speaks to some of the issues that James was raising, and also I think resonates with Natasha's story, that are we actually seeing practice that is avoidant from people, where they don't want to have these conversations because they aren't sure what to do if they get a positive answer. If you ask a perpetrator who's, you know, reporting to A&E, or who you're out doing a health check at the family home, and you speak to a potential perpetrator and say, how are you managing conflict with your partner? How are you managing stress levels? What do you do with a positive answer? So I think that can lead to this sort of avoidant or opaque questioning, where it's just either a tick box exercise or we don't even really go there. The other side of that is to not be too blunt or emotional, and to remember your goal. I mean, why are we there in that household as professionals? We're not there to judge that person's behavior and say how abhorrent we find it, even if that's how we feel. That doesn't serve the function of actually helping stop abuse occurring in that household. So we've really got to get that balance of being clear, objective, and direct. Could we go to the next slide, please? And then I've got some examples of that. So too vague would be, I'd like us to have a chat about how things are going. Too blunt is, you need to come and see me about your abusive behavior towards your partner. And direct is, we need to meet to talk about what happens when you and your partner argue. So the person knows I'm going to be asking questions about an area they might feel uncomfortable about, but I haven't stacked that with judgment or tried to avoid it. Okay, next slide. Empathy. So this is your kind of dual combination. Empathy is about, as a professional skill, it's about being able to understand where that person's head is at. And I think some of the incredibly powerful stories we've heard today, that's quite a difficult place to put yourself, to think, I need to put myself in that perpetrator's head and think, Why do they think that this is the way to solve their problems? The challenge of that is that we're not trying to be collusive or sympathetic to them, but it's also not helpful to be judgmental or indignant about, well, I can't even fathom why you would do that. So I find it quite useful to think about empathy as curiosity. I'm curious about what was going on in your head. What was your thinking? And I want to understand that. And I want to understand that because I want to actually stop that behavior. And I can't do that unless I understand the thinking that's gone behind it. Next slide, please. I'll just give some examples of that. So collusive would be tipping over off that tightrope into saying, oh, it must be really difficult to keep your cool when your partner acts like that towards you. And the problem there is that you're giving an opinion on something they've said, and our opinion about it doesn't matter. We can still acknowledge what they've said without giving an opinion. So the curious response is, you've said that it upsets you. Tell me more about what happens when you feel upset. So we're just using what that person's described, and we're curious, we're interested. Judgmental would be, you said it upsets you. How do you think your partner and kids feel when you start shouting? And I think a lot of professionals, we feel obligated to go straight to that space of hold you to account, be responsible. Well, if I don't even understand my own emotions behind how I'm behaving, how could I possibly empathize with what I'm putting my partner and children through? So part of it is we've got to show that empathy as professionals in the first place for them to start to be able to model it. Okay, next slide. So we've got empathy, and then the next one is autonomy. And this is really useful, I think, for services in thinking, where does this person's level of choice lie in this situation? And it goes back to what I was saying about, you can have the bottom line where there has to be an absolute. For instance, if someone has to be removed from the residence, or they need to have no contact conditions put in place, then you hold those principles. But what we should do is try and provide choice wherever possible. So that shouldn't be token gestures of choice or a pressure to cooperate, but a genuine effort to provide some choice. Could we go to the next slide, please? So I'll just give you an example of this from practice. I had a really interesting case that was presented to me with the IOM team in the Metropolitan Police who were using Engage. And basically this was a case of adult son to adult elderly parent abuse, where the son was a drug user, chronic drug user, and would frequently break into the property and demand money from his mum, literally sort of sitting on the end of the bed, waking her up in the middle of the night saying, give me money, give me money, give me money, until she would. And the response was to obtain a restraining order, which then barred him from entering the property. But I can just imagine, if I ask you, what do you think mum's response to enforcing the conditions of the restraining order was? She wouldn't. She would let her son in and she would give him money. And this seemed a really difficult position where the professionals working with her were saying, you absolutely can't do this. You have to do what's in line with the conditions. And she was saying, I'm not going to do that. So we have to think in that situation, where can we give mum genuine choice? We can't say, well, carry on and let him keep stealing from you and being abusive to you. But what the professionals in that case did is they said, right, so what would you like to happen? Well, I'd like him to be able to come over for Sunday roast, and I would like to be able to give him £25 a week. Okay, so we're going to work out a plan, a stepwise plan, where we work towards those objectives, those goals that you want, and we're going to set those limits and put those conditions in place. So part of it was just being prepared to listen to mum as a victim and not simply say, we know what's best for you. but to say, I've got a bottom line to protect your safety, but I'll try and work within that with you. Okay, and now the last one, if we go to the next slide, please, is reflection. And this is a skill that I think, you know, most professionals who work with people engage in this, whether you know that's what you're doing or not. But it's really using your client's speech back to them, and whether that's their verbatim speech, something that they've just said, where you almost parrot it back. I mean, it's a bit of a psychologist. But also it could be those deeper things of when they're speaking to you about those issues, what's underneath the message that they're saying. So I'll often ask my facilitators, when you've got a perpetrator who comes in and is saying, oh, it's all her, it's all made up, the social worker's just been out to get me from the word go because she doesn't like my family, etc. Think, what's underneath that resistance? What's the message that person's really trying to give? And then reflect that back, and that helps people start to feel understood and heard, even at a deeper level. So there is a bit of a handy acronym forming here of HERE. So we've got honesty, empathy, autonomy, and lastly, reflection. If we could just go to the next slide. So reflection is avoiding this kind of formulaic, and I think James, you said, like certainly routine inquiry needs to be useful and meaningful rather than just a kind of procedural or tick box exercise. So we aren't going to get to the root of things by just simply asking the question verbatim off a form. And we certainly also aren't going to get there by lecturing, saying to somebody, you need to just stay calm and walk away. Reflection can actually encourage somebody to view their own issues and encourage that motivation for them to finally tackle them. So a reflection would be something like, you said sometimes it feels impossible to control your anger. Tell me about any warning signals that you get before things get that bad. And I'll just give you one final example, and then I promise I'll stop talking. But from a case that I was working with, there was a perpetrator who we were working with who had come in from work to find his partner on the phone, sat on the sofa, and the 2-year-old child was in the middle of the lounge floor crying her eyes out, and obviously had been crying for quite some time, red in the face, you know, snot's coming out of her nose. And he looked at his partner and said, why haven't you picked up the baby? To which she said, well, I'm on my phone. At which point he smacked the phone out of her hand, hit her in the jaw, pulled her off the sofa by her legs, giving her carpet burns all up her legs, and then hits her several times on the floor. Now, the difficulty when you're working with someone like that is to think, what is the more moral compass that you can cling on to in that story? And it is that what prompted his completely abhorrent and unacceptable abusive behavior was a moral value that is true, which is something that we would want to encourage, which is that he doesn't think children should be distressed. Now, we have all kinds of other values around the fact that he thinks it's only mum's job to comfort her, or that he thinks that that's an appropriate way to deal with it. But all I had to say to him was acknowledge, so you were distressed about seeing your child upset. And he said, yeah, my mum got done for neglect. And so I vowed that that would never happen to my child. And I said, okay, I get that. I understand that. Can you tell me about what she was doing whilst this was going on between you and your partner? And that was all it took, was to reflect that. And he sat back and he said she was screaming her head off. Why did I do that? I caused her so much more distress by what I did than what my partner did, just, you know, ignoring her. And it's things like that. That's a difficult conversation. But if I had leapt on him and said, you know, how could you possibly think that that was the way to solve the problem? We wouldn't have actually got any further to understanding what was going on in that household and why. So those 4 principles for me can really help you structure these difficult conversations. And it's things like this that we've included in the Engage workbooks, which are aimed at frontline professionals to try and build up that confidence of directly engaging with perpetrators, and not necessarily, you know, long-term, as James was mentioning, the kind of limitations of what's available in this sector mean that long-term therapeutic relationship isn't always possible. But if you've just got that one opportunity to have that conversation, then we need to make that as impactful and likely to get us engagement and rapport rather than disguised compliance or concealment of what's going on. Because if we don't know what's happening in that household, we can't take any safeguarding action. Okay, I'll stop there. I know I have got a slide at the very end, and I don't know if it's worth us popping that up. Oh, sorry, can we skip past this one and the next one? And the next one. Yes. So what was mentioned as well was this idea of resilience and coping in this current crisis. And I think that is both for professionals and for our clients that we're working with. So I'll just mention that I've been involved in a project with the University of Liverpool called Project Aries, which is for frontline medical staff to help them build up day-to-day coping and resilience with what they're having to go through to try and protect us from what's happening. But what we've also done is to adapt that tool to provide a daily resilience check that is useful for professionals and also hopefully for clients to be able to build up more positive coping strategies or reinforce the positive resilience that people are drawing on and try and help people through this. So that's another area that hopefully people could go and have a look at and see if you think that might be useful.
Thank you very much. Thanks. Thanks very much, Emily. That was really interesting, and we will share the links to the Project Aries as well on our COVID site. We have had a few questions in that we're not going to have time to go through. One that I did just want to flag is a police officer asking that because perpetrators currently have more control over lockdown, relaxing lockdown may be a trigger, and do we think there's going to be a spike in DA and domestic abuse homicides after lockdown? If so, what can we do to prevent this? And we've only got 5 minutes, and it would not be okay to try and answer that now, I don't think, unless somebody wants to come in. Emily almost looks poised to respond.
Yeah, only because I thought of this earlier. I've actually had feedback from one of our services that particularly for our what we would class as borderline perpetrators, so with more pathology where it's all about that coercive control, so particularly coercive controlling perpetrators. I think, unfortunately, lockdown creates yes, it's a pressure cooker, but it almost creates this nirvana where they can have absolute, microscopic control over their partners and children. And she was saying, what do I do when this chap I'm working with, he's really happy. He's actually, he says, oh, things have never been better. And I can see that's because he can control everything. And so we, set out strategies about exactly that, how to risk reduce and check in on the knowledge that risk will escalate as these lockdown procedures are starting to be lifted.
Thanks, Emily. One thing that I would like to ask people who are listening is we're going to share a feedback form with you at the end of this. If you would like us to repeat something similar, I'm not asking the speakers to hold their hands up and say they want to be part of it, but certainly this is something that we can consider doing again. If there's specific topics that you'd like us to discuss, then it's certainly something that we can put into our melting pot. On the final slide, there is a link to, or next to last slide maybe, there is a link to our website where we have a COVID-19 page, which Joe mentioned at the beginning. We have been uploading lots and lots of materials and guidance. There'll be a link to Emily's project, and also the form that she mentioned for debriefing. Emily's also on there doing a podcast, and there's other podcasts as well. So thank you all so much for listening. The time has flown by. I'd love to have another half an hour, and maybe next time we can try and do a longer one. I just want to share a few comments that have come in relation to Natasha sharing her story. Someone said that she thinks, I think I'm stunned about how Natasha was treated. Thank you for sharing. Thank you for sharing, Natasha. It truly reflects the need for advocacy to initiate change so survivors are treated better. And someone else, thank you for sharing such a tragic and powerful story. Avoidant or judgmental practice is so frustrating to hear about, and I'm sorry that was your experience. Speaks so powerfully to the need for culture shift, which is absolutely right. And some of you may know that SafeLives run programs around changing culture. Domestic abuse matters is one that's been rolled out across the country, and I don't have the number of horses in my mind, but it's in the mid-20s at least who've taken that on. We also have children's social care behaviour change programs as well. And Natasha and Rachel have both contributed to a set of multi-agency values and multi-agency principles, which has specifically been developed. That there's some reflection of your principles in there as well, Emily, to create a better working together culture that includes working with families and in a way that they need and want to be worked with, which is similar to what Emily was just talking about as well. And I just want to close by letting you know that SafeLives and our pioneers, we launched a Reach In campaign today, and lots of what's been described absolutely underpins why we've created this campaign that we hope is going to be something that's really quite significant, not just in COVID, but also beyond, when we always talk about people seeking help, giving them helpline numbers, contacting this, that and the other, and hopefully getting the right response. But actually, all of us have an opportunity to be able to reach in and help individuals, families for whom reaching out is nigh on impossible. And we're learning how to do that through COVID. We're being asked to do that through COVID when we've got neighbours who might be unwell or might not be able to get out. And we want to for us to demonstrate that and be able to do that in the domestic abuse situation, or more broadly abuse that people might be experiencing. So please visit our website, have a look at the campaign page, have a look at the COVID page, share your feedback, and thank you so much to all of the speakers. It's been absolutely fascinating. We've all earned at least a gin, a glass of wine or a cup of tea. So thank you so much, and we'll be in touch. Thanks, everybody.